I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Let's start with Communications and Multimedia Minister Saifuddin Abdullah's statement that the Perikatan National Government will amend the Finas Act to ensure it is up to date. Now, this means that social media users are free to produce and upload videos online without the need to apply for a license and, quote, without worry about being prosecuted by Finas, end quote. Now, I'm just wondering whether this statement has laid to rest that immense backlash that we saw online regarding the statement that caused this.
Yeah, absolutely, Melissa. I think this will come as a relief. No doubt there will be people criticizing the government for its early, mishandling of the issue in the sense that there was a lack of clarity.
Right.
And that lack of clarity, of course, spurned a lot of memes and a lot of mockery online. But I think we need to go back to the what set this all off, which is the issue of Al Jazeera and that particular documentary they made. And that issue has yet to be resolved.
Yes, true.
How and what kind of attitude should our government have towards foreign broadcasters, journalists who create or bring a critical point of view to the public? And
I'm glad that you brought that up, because you remember Al Jazeera once had a studio in Malaysia, right? And that was a point of pride for Malaysia to, that Al Jazeera had a studio in London and Doha and one in
Washington DC and Washington DC. And indeed, right? So here it was, Malaysia was the backdrop for an international broadcaster, and we and the city and its skyline was part of their international kind of optics, and it really was good for the city. But what it does, it imposes a kind of, I think, obligation on the part of that government or that city that's hosting such a broadcaster, is to embrace global norms when it comes to freedom of speech and the ability for a diversity of views to be aired.
I'm really heartened by this commitment by the MCMC minister to say that they will relook the Finas Act, because the Finas Act was I guess is in 1981, isn't it? It's been 40 years since the Finas Act was enacted, and the video and film world has changed tremendously. Whether or not we want to have this act in this new world, whether we know what exactly the parameters are when it comes to licensing of of film by Finas, I believe the CIJ, the Centre for Independent Journalists, have called for the licensing jurisdiction of this Finas Act to be clearly defined so that it's not used to censor or to control any kind of conversation that perhaps might rub the ruling government the wrong way.
Yeah, I think a lot of people on TikTok will be very relieved to hear that we've moved past this moment. But again, the issue of Al Jazeera and that documentary on the treatment of migrant workers during the lockdown yet to be resolved. To see whether what side of the kind of commitment to freedom of expression this issue falls.
You can go back to creating those TikTok dance videos that you so love, Sharaad.
Right, we'll leave that as it is, right? Okay,
moving
along.
Not the news. We have the discussion and the conversation around S. Pavitra and M. Sugu. So, of course, they run the Sugu Pavitra cooking channel on YouTube. Now, today, in a joint press conference, they said that they want to lead a normal life and don't want any publicity. So the husband, Sugu, has been charged with unlawful possession of a weapon and for hitting his wife, Pavitra, and causing injuries to her lips, left cheek and right arm. Now, the charges to which he has pleaded not guilty. Well, Pavitra has withdrawn her police report against her husband, and she has said that she has forgiven him. The celebrity couple's private affairs continue to be the subject of debate and speculation. In fact, the Women Aid organization has criticized media reports that suggest that this is a private domestic matter to be sorted out by the couple themselves. I believe they tweeted to say that, domestic abuse is not a private matter that needs to be sorted out.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think it might not be intuitive when you say something like that, right? And you have to kind of sort of unpack WAO's intervention there to recognize that, yes, on one level it is, because it's between two people. In this case, people are married to each other. But because it is of a criminal nature, meaning if violence is used, then it isn't a question of whether Pavitra has or chooses to forgive her husband. It really is a criminal act, and the police can prosecute on that basis alone. The other thing, of course, is that it is, and this is the complexity, I think, Melissa, that's arisen, is that they're a celebrity couple. So they've become a model, and they're a model for so many things, I think. Perhaps much of it unintended, but the rags to riches story of people from the margins coming into the center, and people who worked hard and therefore are very deserving of the success they had. All that now undercut by this act of violence. Allegedly, he said that he says he's pleaded not guilty to those charges.
So it's going to be decided now in the courts. Now, and I'm wondering whether a custodial sentence for any domestic abuser will actually resolve the underlying personal and, let's admit it, cultural issues that led to the abuse. Now, and one of the things that I also wanted us to think about is the role of the media when it comes to this, right? Because even well-intentioned reporting can sometimes perpetuate the problem of domestic abuse, and I wanted the media to take a closer look at that. I came across a 2009 study that said what happened in the media is that the media can subtly induce society to justify violence against women, often looking for a reason, so creating a narrative, whether that be alcohol as the reason for abuse, whether that be we want a story, don't we? We want to know what the motive is, so we can kind of understand the reasons behind it. And sometimes the media is complicit in this. Yeah, I mean, there are all kinds of dimensions. I think we need a whole show for this, Melissa, yes, because as you say, I mean, there are things to unpack that are deeply held in our society, and many of our societies that make up Malaysia, about gender relations, about the role of women, about the role of men, and what happens when there's a reversal of this. There's a threat, as it were, to the man's supremacy within the household. All these might have been operating in that particular instance. We don't really know, and I'm not here to judge them, but it does take place, and we need to have a public conversation about why men resort to violence against their loved ones. Okay, well, that's a lot to consider, but let's take a quick break, and in just a few minutes what we're going to do is we're going to come back and take a closer look at what the recent statistics on the COVID-19 cases telling us about the pandemic's trajectory. So stay tuned to consider this. Watching Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. With me is Sharaad Kuttan. Now, the Ministry of Health has raised the flag that the rising trend of daily COVID-19 cases and the recent new clusters are most probably caused by public complacency and non-compliance with the government's instructions in handling the pandemic. Now, the question we'd like to consider tonight is what the statistics on COVID-19 are telling us about the trajectory of this disease. Joining us in the studio tonight We have Dr. Helmy Haja Mydin. He's a consultant respiratory physician at KL Pantai Hospital in KL. Dr. Helmy, welcome to the show. It's good to have you here.
Hi, good evening.
I'd like to begin with how a majority of us understand the numbers that are reported by MOH. Now, these statistics are being deployed to justify policy or changes in policy, so it's important for us to adequately understand what these numbers represent, what they really mean. So, tell us how you're reading the numbers. What do the numbers tell you about the trajectory of this disease?
I would say that things are getting worse. Now, you can look at the numbers in various ways. You can look at it from an epidemiological point of view, looking at the trajectory that the models are telling us. You can also, from a lay perspective, actually look at the day-to-day reports. And something as simple as there was one case a day last week, now there are double digits a day, that should tell you that things are not as well controlled as they should be. Right. Now, there may also be some significance attached to the fact that some of these cases are from people who have come back from abroad versus something that has been naturally spreading within the community. So that also can give people the impression that maybe one is more dangerous than the other, or one is actually more significant than the other. But at the end of the day, it's not just Malaysia. If we look at how the situation has been globally, the two things that stand out when it comes to why there are multiple waves are the fact that as a society, there's been some degree of complacency when it comes to the use of masks, the use of social distancing, and of course, travel as well. So it's not just Malaysia. If you look at places like Hong Kong, you've got people who are coming back from ships, coming from abroad, bringing the virus with them. And this just goes to show that this is something that is long-standing. And while everyone uses the term new normal every single day, they don't seem to understand that we have to actually practice this new normal, and what it means to you and me may be quite different from what it means to everyone. But ultimately, there's one basic concept that we need to focus on, which is that we need to keep the virus away from each other.
Okay, I want to ask you this, right? And the lockdown is an extraordinary circumstance, right? Because it's predicated on actually stopping much of economic and social activity. It is the abnormal, as it were, right? And so numbers are great when we have this abnormal situation. If we will return, we must return to normality in terms of economic activity, even if we were 100% compliant in terms of social distancing, mask wearing, and so on and so forth, washing our hands. Wouldn't we still get a rise in numbers? Wouldn't that just be a natural outcome of social interactions returning to normal?
It won't get back to normal, and you're right. Throughout history, as a species, we have been faced with infectious disease at multiple times, and everyone likes to use the Spanish flu as an example to compare how things are. And with the Spanish flu, for example, what the evidence also shows is that if you were to start lockdown early, and if you were to do it properly, by that, no kind of grey areas, you do it properly, you are very strict, the earlier and harder you do it actually leads to better medium to long-term economic outcomes. And it's a bit of a fallacy to isolate the two. Economy development, economic progress is very much linked to how the health is. So public health is very important because it drives your economic growth. And without that, you're not going to get the growth that you're looking for. You get all these predictions, right, from IMF, from the World Bank, from our own banks with regards to what growth is going to be. But it's all predicated on how well controlled our public health service is actually, what we're actually doing with our public health when it comes to controlling the disease.
Okay. So, in the early days of the lockdown of the MCO, we were taught it was to flatten the curve. Yep. Now, we're no longer using the phrase flatten the curve. What is the issue now? Is flattening the curve no longer the issue at hand?
It will always be the issue. I would say we managed to flatten the curve. That's probably why it's kind of gone out of our day-to-day vocab. If we were to compare ourselves with, say, the States or Brazil, the curve in terms of the numbers of cases at some points were quite exponential. Whereas in Malaysia, we've had that rise, we've had that fall. The problem now is we're seeing that little rise again. And I've been asked many times whether we are facing a second wave. Right. But really, with this disease, it'll be multiple waves. It's just a question of how high it goes up. And once again, we want to flatten that so that we do not get overwhelmed when it comes to the utilization of our healthcare services. So that has not changed. I would say that because the Ministry of Health has been successful in actually keeping things at bay, you feel a little bit desensitized. You feel that, hey, it's okay. You know, no one I know has got COVID anymore. So people become a bit more relaxed, a bit nonchalant about things. And of course, that can lead to what we're seeing now, which is an increase in the cases again.
I want to ask you about the language you use, especially in the media, spikes and so on and so forth. What numbers would we have to be statistically significant, right? So if you have, today you have 3, tomorrow you have 21, the day after you have, a fall in terms of active cases or positives that you found, is that statistically significant from an epidemiological point of view?
It depends very much on the models. So for example, when you look at the mathematical models, there will be points on the graph that you want to trace, and you compare that with what you're expecting. And you can, in a way, predict where things are going. Now, there wouldn't be a specific number that makes you go, hey, that's dangerous, right? But, and I think Dr. Hisham had mentioned, was it today or yesterday, about the R naught coming into play again.
It's back in the conversation. It wasn't part of the conversation for months.
Exactly. Because it's gone above 1 now.
It's gone above 1. Okay. And I think if it's above 1.6, then what you tend to find, based on various models, that the numbers will then keep going up. So previously we had situations where, you had 10, 15, 20, and then it was 88, 89, and then more than 100. So we don't want to get back to that state. We want to keep things at bay. And otherwise, we're going to face another situation where we'll be forced to lock down society. But then the question becomes whether you do it at a more national level or rather you do it more regionally or more locally, because that, once again, as we mentioned before, is going to have a huge impact on the economy.
Okay, so based on these numbers, it will impact policy in some shape or form. One of the things that we've seen recently is the use of the mandatory masks being made mandatory for crowded spaces and public transport, if I'm not mistaken, starting next Saturday. So is that the right first step based on these numbers? That you're looking at the numbers and you're thinking this is the first step for a policy change leading up to managing this pandemic?
The idea of getting people to wear the mask is correct. That is something that we have come to some form of, I suppose, a uniform opinion over the past few months. At the very beginning, some of us, myself included, were not very fussed about the mask. And when we did think that there were issues with masks, it was also a case of making sure that enough were kept for frontliners. But we now have a situation where there is sufficient cloth masks, surgical masks. This one that I have here is my hospital mask because I need to get myself protected from other germs like TB, for example. But the idea of making people wear masks at the right places, where it's congested, where it's indoors, when the ventilation system may not be appropriate, is correct. Whether or not you need a law to enforce that, I think is debatable. Right. Because if you look at, once again, situations across the globe, in the UK, for example, you have a situation where the government says it's compulsory, but the police force have come out and said that, we're not going to waste time enforcing this because we've got other more important things to do. So really, it's all about the messaging. I would much rather see politicians, newscasters, guests on talk shows wear masks and talk about masks, so that the idea percolates down throughout all the viewership. And this applies not just to TV shows, but you could use, you could get Dato' Saifuddin to help us make videos. You could get things done on social media. You can do your TikTok.
So public messaging.
Exactly.
Public messaging on masks.
That, I feel, there's a lot more that we can do. We're doing a good job, with Dato' Hisham. Once again, if you look at his daily conferences, he always finishes with the message, right? The things that you need to do, the things that you need to avoid. And that shouldn't be just the job of the Ministry of Health. It should be something that's more across the board.
All right. Okay, we're going to take a quick break. Let's continue our discussion with Dr. Helmy, and we're going to talk about vaccine hesitancy. Stay tuned to consider this. Thanks so much for staying with Sharaad and I on Consider This. Let's continue our conversation with Dr. Helmy Haja Mydin. He's a consultant respiratory physician at Pantai Hospital in KL. Now, everyone's waiting with bated breath for the results of dozens of vaccine trials, medical fraternity, governments, pharmaceutical companies. But opinion polls are suggesting that vaccine hesitancy might hinder our fight against this disease. How are we to think through this problem, Helmy? Because it does raise a lot of complex issues. The issues of individual rights versus the collective interest, issues of public policy, whether government needs to make it mandatory, as we discussed it before the break with masks, or should it be voluntary? How do we think about this?
Just trying to think, where do I begin? I think the first thing to bear in mind is that the vaccine is not going to be the solution that everyone's hoping for. I have come across folks who think that by having a vaccine, the economy goes back to normal, travel goes back to how it was before. But as you pointed out, not everyone's going to want to have it, not everyone's going to be able to take it, because, for example, if you were pregnant, if you had cancer, you may be in a category that does not allow you to take the vaccine. We don't know yet. There are over 100 trials going on when it comes to vaccines. There are 3 in particular that appear to be quite promising. There's one in the States, one in the UK, one in China. And they are undergoing phase 3 trials where they are actually looking at how it affects people as well as the potential side effects. Okay. Now, if we look at all the literally hundreds of vaccines that we have already, the only disease we've ever really cured as a species is smallpox. We still have measles, we still have mumps, we have rubella, we have hepatitis. There's all kinds of diseases out there that even though we have the vaccine for, it's not being utilized fully. Partly it's because of miscommunication. Going back to our earlier point about public messaging as well, that's going to be very important. And I think if and when the time comes when we have a vaccine, that's going to be of the utmost priority. We talk about whether it should be mandatory, but the question really also should be whether we'll actually get sufficient in the first place. If we look at what the United States did once upon a time with those N95 masks, they basically, they literally took away a supply. Recently, they bought over stocks of drugs that were deemed to be helpful with the management of COVID-19. What's to say that's not going to happen again with the vaccines, especially in a country where, I've lost count now, millions have been affected. So that is going to be more of an issue to me, the diplomacy that's going to be needed, the degree of nationalism that's going to rise because of people wanting to stockpile their vaccines. So eventually when it does come to Malaysia, it's going to be then a case of making sure that it's a pathway that the right people get it. And we need to make a tough decision as to who gets it first.
Right, so these will be the vulnerable communities. I want to see, this links to our earlier discussion about non-compliance, right? How people understand the disease and their relationship to it. And with vaccine hesitancy, we have several things. We've always had this problem, maybe a marginal one, of anti-vaxxers, right? And that's emerged. And I want tap you for your understanding of how deep the problem is, because in the US and in the UK recently, when they did polls on whether people would accept a COVID-19 vaccine, the numbers were shockingly low, meaning too low to have that herd immunity that is essential to the science of vaccines. Tell us, do we have a problem in Malaysia? I mean, all things being equal, with vaccine hesitancy?
We don't have the data, but we don't have that much of a movement when it comes to anti-vaxxers in Malaysia as compared to overseas, particularly in the West. There are some groups that use religion as a reason to not get vaccination, but we are quite fortunate in that our religious authorities are actually very supportive of vaccines in Malaysia, and they make it a point to go out of their way to explain why it's helpful and why it's useful and important not just for the individual but for your own community. So there is that sense of responsibility there as well. So going back to messaging, it involves all the appropriate stakeholders. So if religion or misinformation, cultural issues are the issue, then we need to find the right people to talk to people about that.
Right, but do people who are hesitant, as it were, have genuine cause to be so? For instance, I'm not talking about the conspiracy theories that anti-vaxxers might indulge in. I'm talking about the fact that in fast-tracking a vaccine, people now saying, well, will this vaccine actually be safe? What would you say to them?
It's a fair question, and it's a question you should ask of every single tablet. You could take paracetamol and you could end up with liver failure if you're unlucky. So, first do no harm being our first principle in medicine. That's always our priority. So it goes back to the studies. Now, you're absolutely right in that there's been some fast tracking. So, for example, the EU and the United States have waived the need to do animal studies for the COVID vaccines. They're just going through to human trials straight away. Along the way, the data that comes up is going to be of utmost importance, and that's where we as doctors, we as policymakers will need to scrutinize this data before pushing it out to the public, because you don't want to push something to the public and then find out 1 month down the line that half of them are getting brain injury or something, or that's the kind of danger that you're going to have, where you have that loss of trust. Right now, we have some degree of trust between the Ministry of Health with the population at large, and we need to make sure we don't misuse that. And when we are providing information, we are as transparent about the benefits as well as the risk.
I want to ask you as a doctor, there's a bit more philosophical question. You mentioned the number of diseases that we have lived with throughout our evolution as a species, and you mentioned smallpox as an exception to that. And you also mentioned tuberculosis earlier, TB in our discussion. Is COVID-19, the coronavirus and the disease COVID-19, something we're going to have to live with? And if that's the case, would it mean to live with something like COVID-19?
It would be like how we live with TB, how we live with influenza. We went through MERS-CoV, we went through avian flu. So it comes to a point where hopefully we'll be able to control the numbers, where the numbers that actually permeate through society is within a certain limit that doesn't overwhelm our services. So once again, we have lived with infectious disease for centuries, if not longer. And what we need to find out is if there are vaccines, then we try to vaccinate and protect those that we can. Those who unfortunately fall within the gaps where they need medical treatment, we have to make sure that they do get the treatment that they need. But we must also remember that there are other conditions out there, TB being one of them. In 2018, we had about 25,000 cases, I think, of which I think it was about 1,500 or so that died. So we've had more fatalities annually from things like TB, which for better or for, not for better or for worse, for worse, we've kind of become quite, used to it. And we just accept it. And that is not necessarily the right thing. And right now, that's our concern. The public is probably thinking, it's only a few people who are going to be affected by COVID.
And we've lived with other diseases before.
Exactly. So, and I suspect people are going to be more concerned about the lockdown rather than the health implications. And, if that kind of fear is what's needed to drive people to behave, then that's the kind of messaging that perhaps should be increased.
Okay, well, thank you so much for coming on the show and talking to us tonight. We really appreciate your time.
Pleasure.
That's all the time we have on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching. Good night.
Thank you.